They called him Old Hickory, America's first working-class president. A hero to the common man, a barbarian to the upper class, a cold-hearted demon to Indians, a steely-eyed fighter who made every battle personal. On dueling grounds, battlefields, and in the White House. A shrewd politician who branded his own form of democracy, who despised paper money, yet ended up on the $20 bill. Andrew Jackson.
On March 15, 1767, a man who was one of the most powerful and influential presidents of the 19th century was born. He symbolized the democratic advances of his time, and his actions strengthened the power of the presidential office in American government. He was a classic example of the self-made man who rose from a log cabin to the White House and came to represent the aspirations of the ordinary citizen struggling to achieve wealth and status. He symbolized the rise of the common man. So total was his identification with his period of American history that the years between 1828 and 1848 are frequently designated the Age of Jackson. His name is Andrew Jackson. He was an American statesman who served as the 7th President of the United States from 1829 to 1837. Jackson's presidency marked the beginning of the ascendancy of the spoils system in American politics. He undoubtedly had the greatest influence on America's presidential policies and governmental activities. Jackson was looked down upon through the eyes of skeptical critics, but he established the first pocket veto to be recorded in the history of America. This week's edition of People in History salutes a man who was famous for the events and accomplishments of his presidency, a man who is also known for having signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which forcibly relocated a number of native tribes in the South to Indian Territory.
He believed on the basis of his own experience, what he had seen historically, that whites and Indian tribes could not live together peacefully. And he made it his position from the time he became president to encourage, ultimately to force, the Indian tribes that remained as tribes in the eastern part of the United States to move from the eastern part of the United States across the Mississippi to the unorganized territories west of the Mississippi.
I read an account written by a Cherokee soldier who was with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. That Cherokee rifleman said, had he known in 1814 what Andrew Jackson was going to do to the Cherokee Nation, he would have shot him in the field that day.
Andrew Jackson was born on March 15, 1767. His parents were Scots-Irish colonists Andrew and Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson, Presbyterians who had immigrated from Ireland 2 years earlier. Jackson's father was born in Carrickfergus, County Antrim, in current-day Northern Ireland, around 1738. Jackson's parents lived in the village of Bonnybefore, also in County Antrim. His patrilineal family line originated in Killingsworth Grove, Yorkshire, England. When they immigrated to North America in 1765, Jackson's parents probably landed in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Most likely they traveled overland through the Appalachian Mountains to the Scots-Irish community in the Washoe region, straddling the border between North and South Carolina. They brought 2 children from Ireland, Hugh, born in 1763, and Robert in 1764. Jackson's father died in an accident in February 1767 at the age of 29, 3 weeks before his son Andrew was born in the Washoe area. His exact birth site is unclear because he was born about the time his mother was making a difficult trip home from burying Jackson's father. The area was so remote that the border between North and South Carolina had not been officially surveyed. In 1824, Jackson wrote a letter saying that he was born at an uncle's plantation in Lancaster County, South Carolina, but he may have claimed to be a South Carolinian because the state was considering nullification of the Tariff of 1824, which he opposed. In the mid-1850s, second-hand evidence indicated that he may have been born at a different uncle's home in North Carolina. During the Revolutionary War, Jackson, at age 13, informally helped the local militia as a courier. His eldest brother, Hugh, died from heat exhaustion during the Battle of Stono Ferry on June 20, 1779. He and his brother Robert were captured by the British and held as prisoners. They nearly starved to death in captivity. When Andrew refused to clean the boots of a British officer, the officer slashed at the youth with a sword, leaving him with scars on his left hand and head, as well as an intense hatred for the British.
Jackson, with that insolence that would characterize him for his entire life, refused. He said, "I'm a prisoner of war and I demand to be treated accordingly."
Jackson had always been a sassy kid, and now he was miffed at having been taken prisoner. And the officer pulls his sword and takes a swipe at Jackson's head. And Jackson throws up his arm and caught the sword on the side of his hand, but it didn't quite prevent the sword from hitting him in the head. And blood runs down, and for the rest of his life, he had this scar on his hand and a crease in his skull.
While imprisoned, the brothers contracted smallpox, and Robert Jackson died on April 27, 1781, a few days after their mother, Elizabeth, secured their brother's release.
She essentially made her case to the British officers in charge of the camp. These are only boys. You got to let them out. A mother's love, a mother's anger ultimately sufficed to spring Jackson and his brother.
When she received her two sons that were both desperately ill, she had only one horse, so she put the older boy, who was far worse, on the horse, and they walked about 40 miles. Jackson had to walk that distance behind them, still suffering from smallpox, and by the time they got home, the older boy was dead, and Jackson was delirious.
After being assured Andrew would recover, she volunteered to nurse prisoners of war on board two ships in Charleston Harbor, where there had been an outbreak of cholera. In November 1781, she died from the disease and was buried in an unmarked grave.
He's taken up by one of the relatives, and he lives in the house, and there was some visitor who threatened him at one time, as I recall, and raised his hand to strike him. And the kid says to him, "If you touch me, if you strike me, you're a dead man."
As a young boy, he was a real hellion. I mean, he fought, he cursed, he drank, he smoked tobacco. He did everything he wasn't supposed to do, and his mama wanted him to be a Presbyterian preacher. That didn't work out.
Andrew became an orphan at age 14 following the deaths of his brothers, mother and father, and during the war, Jackson blamed the British for his losses. Jackson received a sporadic education in the local Old Field School, and in 1781 he worked for a time in a saddle maker's shop. Later, Jackson taught school and studied law in Salisbury, North Carolina, and in 1787 he was admitted to the bar and moved to Jonesboro in what was then the Western District of North Carolina.
He wanted to better himself. He wanted more out of life. He decided that staying in the Waxhaws after the war offered nothing.
So he decided to do what at times it seemed half the population of the frontier did. He decided to become a lawyer. It was a natural for Jackson. He was an argumentative sort, and lawyers argue for a living.
But he eventually found his way to Salisbury, North Carolina, where he studied the law under the highly esteemed attorney, Spruce McKay. Spruce McKay had already taught the law to William Richardson Davie, a hero, Jackson's hero in the Revolutionary War.
So you found a lawyer who was well established and who had a law library, and you'd read. And if you had any kind of ambition, you'd gradually learn what lawyers did. You'd draw up wills, you'd draw up contracts, you'd learn the process. And if the clients wanted to risk their lawsuits on this young guy with very little experience, then it was their risk. And after a while, they discovered that Jackson was reasonably good at this.
Jackson, although poorly educated, had a great command of the language. And if you read his letters, you know, they're not well constructed always, and he would misspell a word, misspell it in 4 or 5 different ways on the same page. Spelling meant nothing. It was the conviction, it was the passion, it was the temper that he wished to communicate.
Though his legal education was scanty, Jackson knew enough to be a country lawyer on the frontier. Since he was not from a distinguished family, he had to make his career by his own merits, and soon he began to prosper in the rough and tumble world of frontier law. In 1788, he was appointed Solicitor of the Western District and held the same position in the government of the territory south of the River Ohio after 1791.
A prosecutor, a prestigious appointment that did not go over well with many of his more experienced peers, including a lawyer named Waitstill Avery.
He probably said, "You don't really know the law," and I would suspect that might be true. Jackson took offense, and so he challenged him to a duel.
Shortly after Jackson first arrived in Nashville in 1788, he lived as a boarder with Rachel Stockley Donelson, the widow of John Donelson. Here, Jackson became acquainted with their daughter, Rachel Donelson Roberts. At the time, Rachel was in an unhappy marriage with Captain Lewis Roberts. He was subject to fits of jealous rage.
She was already married to a man by the name of Lewis Robards, who was a very suspicious type and who really believed the worst about his wife. His relationship with her was so bad that it was abusive. I don't know that she was physically abused, and probably not, but the mental abuse, I'm convinced, was excessive.
Rachel had determined that she had probably married the wrong man. But in the context of that day, even if you realize you married the wrong man, you had to stay with that man for the rest of your life because there was no way out.
The two were separated in 1790. According to Jackson, he married Rachel after hearing that Robert had obtained a divorce. However, the divorce had never been completed, making Rachel's marriage to Jackson bigamous and therefore invalid. After the divorce was officially completed, Rachel and Jackson remarried in 1794. The controversy surrounding their marriage remained a sore point for Jackson, who deeply resented attacks on his wife's honor.
What they resorted to was self-divorce, something that was not uncommon among the Scotch-Irish in Scotland, not uncommon on the American frontier.
Who married them? We don't know. There is absolutely no evidence. Could it have been a migrant preacher of some kind? Sure. But they were in Spanish territory, and only marriages conducted by a Catholic priest were legitimate.
The reason why history records that Andrew and Rachel Jackson accidentally committed bigamy is that in 1828, when Jackson was running for president, a new moral imperative had taken hold, and the standards, modern standards of middle-class marriage, bourgeois marriage, prevailed. So no one wanted to hear anymore about an irregular frontier marriage, a self-divorce. It wouldn't stand up.
By May 1806, Charles Dickinson had published an attack on Jackson in the local newspaper, and it resulted in a written challenge from Jackson to a duel. Since Dickinson was considered an expert shot, Jackson determined it would be best to let Dickinson turn and fire first, Hoping that his aim might be spoiled in his quickness, Jackson would wait and take careful aim at Dickinson. Dickinson did fire first, hitting Jackson in the chest. The bullet that struck Jackson was so close to his heart that it was never safely removed. Under the rules of dueling, Dickinson had to remain still as Jackson took aim and shot and killed him.
Jackson's honor incorporated everything, including the reputation of his wife. If Jackson did not address it immediately, then his honor would be lost.
Many thought Jackson a fool, as Dickinson was known as the best shot in Tennessee. But Jackson had a daring and risky plan.
Jackson decided in this duel that he wasn't going to try to fire first because he wasn't confident enough of his aim to think that he could hit Dickinson in the heart or in the brain. So he decides ahead of time that he's simply going to stand there and let Dickinson take the first shot at him. Now, as it happened, Dickinson had missed Jackson's heart by no more than about half an inch. The bullet was lodged in Jackson's rib cage.
It's amazing, just a short distance away and Jackson would have been dead. Jackson is supposed to have put his hand to his chest to stanch the bleeding, and very slowly, very carefully, very deliberately, he took aim, fired, and killed him. Jackson, of course, had this chest wound, and he kept the bullet for the rest of his life.
Jackson's behavior in the duel outraged men of honor in Tennessee, who called it a brutal, cold-blooded killing and saddled Jackson with a reputation as a violent, vengeful man. As a result, he became a social outcast.
They systematically slaughtered whomever they found. They took infants by the feet and slammed their heads against the walls of the fort. It was pretty awful. And it's like a terrorist attack today.
Jackson enticed the Indians to come out and to attack him. His boys came out on either side with their guns from the woods, and they had the Indians on three sides, surrounded. There was great bloodshed. I think 400 or 500 Indians were killed at that point, and very few of Jackson's people.
Jackson had 3 adopted sons: Theodore, an Indian about whom little is known; Andrew Jackson Jr., the son of Rachel's brother, Servant Donaldson; and Lincoln, a Creek Indian orphan adopted by Jackson after the Creek War. Lincoln died of tuberculosis in 1828 at the age of 16.
In the aftermath of this battle, Jackson's men come across this very small child. He's an orphan, and he's sitting there surrounded by the smoke and ruin and bodies of the battlefield. And the child is brought to Jackson, and he's asked, what do you do with the kid? And Jackson decides to adopt the child, sends him to Nashville, and he and Rachel raise the child as their own.
I think, as he said, this child was sent to me for some purpose, and he saw in that child himself as a boy, an orphan.
There's this odd combination of the ferocious warrior who can kill tens, dozens, hundreds of Indians in a battle, and then this tender father who is going to take the helpless child, take him into his family, and raise him as his own. Remarkable character, this Jackson.
These historians who say how wonderful he was, well, he adopted an Indian boy. They don't put in there he adopted that Indian boy after he slaughtered their mom and dad.
Jackson was elected as a delegate to the Tennessee Constitutional Convention in 1796. When Tennessee achieved statehood that year, he was elected its U.S. representative. The following year, he was elected U.S. Senator as a Democratic Republican, but he resigned within a year, and in 1798, he was appointed a judge of the Tennessee Supreme Court, serving until 1804.
As a judge, he was very effective. You knew by God what he meant and what he wanted you to do, and you did it. People came to him and they said, "Why did you do that?" And this man said, "I looked at Jackson and there was shoot in his eyes. And there wasn't shoot in the eyes of any of those other men. And so I said to myself, Haas, you better drop your weapons." And I did.
In 1794, Jackson formed a business with fellow lawyer and planter John Overton for the purpose of purchasing lands as well as those lands without military bounds. Upon his return from Florida, Jackson was one of the 3 original investors who founded Memphis, Tennessee in 1819. Upon his return from Florida, Jackson, who was one of the 3 original investors who founded Memphis, Tennessee, in 1829 negotiated the sale of the land from the Chickasaw Nation in 1818. In addition to his legal and political career, Jackson prospered as planter, slave owner, and merchant. He built a home and the first general store in Gallatin, Tennessee in 1803. The next year, he acquired the Hermitage, a 640-acre plantation in Davidson County near Nashville. He later added 360 acres to the plantation, which eventually grew to 1,050 acres. The primary crop was cotton, grown by enslaved workers.
Human slavery was the powerhouse of the early American economy. Slave-grown products were the most valuable exports that the United States produced. Slave-grown cotton, slave-grown rice, slave-grown tobacco spilled out of the plantations of the South, crowded onto boats, enriched the harbors of New York and Boston, and then fed an appetite of a hungry and shivering world. And that's where the money came from. So the people who owned the slaves and the people who bought and sold the produce that the slaves made were the richest people in the country. And it was the desire to get more of those riches that drove Americans into the best cotton country in the world, the country that was possessed by the Creek and the Choctaw and the Cherokee and the Chickasaw Indians.
Starting with 9 slaves, he held as many as 44 by 1820, and later held up to 150 slaves, making him among the planter elite. And throughout his lifetime, Jackson may have owned as many as 300 slaves. African American men, women, and children were kept as slave workers by Jackson on 3 sections of the Hermitage plantation. Slaves lived in extended family units between 5 and 10 persons, quartered in 20-foot square cabins made either of brick or logs.
Andrew Jackson for African Americans is not the sort of figure that one holds very dear.
The size and quality of his Hermitage slave quarters exceeded the standards of his times. To help slaves acquire food staples, in addition to his rations, he supplied slaves with guns, knives, and fishing equipment for hunting and fishing. The Hermitage plantation was a profit-making enterprise, and Jackson, demanding slave loyalty, permitted slaves to be whipped to increase productivity, or if he believed his slaves' offenses were severe enough. At various times, he posted advertisements for his fugitive slaves. For the standards of his times, he was considered a humane slave owner who furnished his slaves food and housing and did not prohibit his female slaves from having children. In 1801, Jackson was appointed commander of the Tennessee militia with the rank of colonel and was later elected major general of the Tennessee militia in 1802.
This may well have been the most important public office in the state, because the commander of the militia was the person charged with defending the community against external attack, which meant typically Indian attack or conceivably attacked by the British or the Spanish.
During the War of 1812, the Shawnee chief Tecumseh encouraged the Red Stick Creek Indians of northern Alabama and Georgia to attack white settlements. He had unified tribes in the Northwest to rise up against the Americans, trying to repel American settlers from those lands north of the Ohio. Occurring at the same time as the War of 1812, the Creek Campaign saw Jackson command the U.S. forces, which included the Tennessee Militia, U.S. Regulars, and Cherokee Choctaw.
What Tecumseh was preaching was frankly nothing less than a race war. This was going to be Indians against whites. Not all the Creeks buy into this. Other Creeks decide that Tecumseh is dreaming, that the Indians will never be able to reclaim their territory. They'll never be able to drive the whites out. And so one of the first results of Tecumseh's efforts is to split the Creek Nation, with the Red Sticks going on the offensive and the other Creeks deciding they don't want to have anything to do with it.
Jackson defeated the Red Sticks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814. U.S. forces and their allies killed 800 Red Stick warriors in this battle, but spared the Chief Red Eagle, a mixed-race man also known as William Weatherford.
Fire! The Red Sticks are simply right behind the walls, and so it's at point-blank range. Sam Houston has to be dragged off of the field, bleeding. It looks like he's going to die from his wounds. But through numbers, through determination, Jackson's men managed to force their way across the top of the wall. It's the most bitter fighting imaginable. And in fact, it's kind of hard to imagine how it all took place because it went on for hours. The carnage that ensued was horrific. According to eyewitness accounts, the river ran red with the blood of the Indians killed.
Officers who had the best opportunities of judging believed the loss of the enemy not to fall short of 800.
What we have at the end of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend is Jackson's men doing a reliable body count among the hundreds of the slain Indians that lay there on the battlefield by slicing off parts of their noses to keep a reliable count.
Weatherford decides that he is going to essentially take responsibility for the uprising, for the rebellion, and presents himself to Jackson and says, "Here I am," essentially as a defeated general.
Mr. Weatherford, I brought you an offering.
And Jackson doesn't know quite what to make of this at first, but treats Weatherford as defeated, honorable enemy and lets him go.
Jackson was quite an egomaniac, and he recognized the leadership and the courage of the opponents because that made him more the man. So when William Weatherford came in and talked with him, I have heard through some of the oral traditions that Weatherford said to him, "If I had another 800 troops, I would still be fighting you." He would not have given up. And Jackson perhaps took Weatherford's attitude and saw something in it of himself.
After the victory, John Armstrong Jr., Madison's Secretary of War, ordered Major General Thomas Pinckney in April 1814 to make the surrender treaty. Pinckney specified the terms of surrender, and these terms included the handing over of an unspecified amount of land, the construction of U.S. forts, the turning over of warriors who instigated hostilities, and an agreement to stop trade with foreign countries. Jackson opposed the unpopular Pinckney Treaty, desiring to end the threats that had caused the conflict with the Creek Nation in the first place.
The terms of that treaty were monstrously unfair, and it took away half the lands of the Creek Nation, very much to the satisfaction, of course, of Jackson.
He didn't see it as, you've done for me and therefore I have to do for you in repayment. All I know is that the Creeks live in this area and they have to be punished, and we are taking away this amount of land. And if you're affected, that's too bad. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is.
Jackson was promoted Mayor General and given charge of the 7th Military District, replacing Mayor General Thomas Flournoy. Jackson, now commanding general, invalidated Pinckney's treaty and specified more direct terms upon both the Upper Creek and the Lower Creek. Ultimately, these terms had the effect of declaring 22 million acres in present-day Georgia and Alabama as open for American settlement. On August 9, 1814, 35 Indian elder leaders signed Jackson's Treaty of Fort Jackson. The warrior faction of the Creek Nation and the British, however, did not formally recognize the treaty. Jackson's service in the War of 1812 against the United Kingdom was conspicuous for bravery and success. When British forces threatened New Orleans, Jackson took command of the defenses, including militia from several western states and territories. He was a strict officer, but was popular with his troops. They said he was tough as Old Hickory wood on the battlefield, and he acquired the nickname of Old Hickory.
Andrew Jackson became Old Hickory when he was coming back from the front down in Mississippi, and he decided that he would walk while the wounded rode. And so he walked all the way home. And his men loved him for it. It was an example of amazing spiritual leadership. And they started calling him Old Hickory because they thought he was as tough as a hickory stick.
In the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815, Jackson's 5,000 soldiers won a decisive victory over 7,500 British soldiers.
The British had used barrels of sugar to fortify their batteries. Not a good idea.
When you hit a barrel of sugar with a cannonball, the sugar goes everywhere. Does not stop the cannonball, but also gets everywhere, including in the breeches of the cannons and in the firing holes and everywhere else, and melts or crystallizes or whatever sugar does when it gets really stressed. So the great artillery duel did not work for the British, and the Americans were greatly cheered to see the British run away from their guns or drag whatever they could of them off.
Hold your fire, man.
Jackson has to calm his men. His militia in particular are used to firing from a distance of 300 yards and then taking up a new position if necessary. Well, there's no new position. You got to stay where you are. And if they fire to great a distance, much of their fire will be wasted. So Jackson has to convince them that they need to wait until the British get close enough that their fire can have a real effect.
Hold your fire.
The American artillery fire has this terrific, horrendous effect on the ranks of the British infantry as they come, just mowing down large numbers. The artillery, they're firing grape shot, they're firing just loose pieces of metal. It's anti-personnel stuff, and it wipes out dozens or hundreds of the British at a blow. But the British keep coming, and they keep coming.
Jackson managed to hold back his anxious sharpshooters until the last possible moment. Finally, he gave the command.
Fire!
Then they unleash this horribly punishing volley, one volley after another. In this case, it's the British ranks that break, and the British are forced to find shelter wherever they can.
Fire the rocket!
Just then, a bullet struck General Pakenham in the leg, and right after that, another bullet struck Pakenham and killed him dead. So the British at that point were without any commanders of a general rank. The regimental commanders were not sure what to do. When that smoke finally drifted away, a horrendous scene revealed itself as a sea of red right before Jackson's rampart. It was the red coats of the British who had been killed. And a silence came over the battlefield because the Americans had stopped shooting.
When the Americans went out there, they couldn't believe what they saw. After they counted up the British killed, wounded, prisoners, the number was more than 2,000. When they counted up their own casualties, killed, wounded, captured, it was about 24.
Jackson and his army of misfits had achieved what the U.S. regular army in Washington could not. They had defeated the most powerful army in the world.
At the end of the battle, the British had 2,037 casualties, 291 dead, including 3 senior generals, 1,262 wounded, and 484 captured or missing. The Americans had 71 casualties, 13 dead, 39 wounded, and 19 missing. In March 1815, Jackson ordered the arrest of U.S. District Court Judge Dominic A. Hall after the judge signed a writ of habeas corpus on behalf of a Louisiana legislator that Jackson had arrested. Louis Loelier had written an anonymous piece in the New Orleans newspaper challenging Jackson's refusal to release the militia after the British ceded the field of battle. Jackson had claimed the authority to declare martial law over the entire city of New Orleans, not merely his camp. After ordering the arrest of a Louisiana legislator, a federal judge, a lawyer, and after intervention of Joshua Lewis, a state judge who was simultaneously serving under Jackson in the militia and who also signed a writ of habeas corpus against Jackson, his commanding officer, seeking Judge Hall's release, Jackson relented. Civilian authorities in New Orleans had reason to fear Jackson, but they fared better than did the 6 members of the militia whose executions, ordered by Jackson, would suffice as the coffin handbills during his 1828 presidential campaign. Nonetheless, Jackson became a national hero for his actions in the Battle of the War of 1812. By a resolution on February 27, 1815, Jackson received the thanks of Congress as well as a Congressional Gold Medal. Alexis de Tocqueville, underwhelmed by Jackson, later commented in Democracy in America that Jackson, I quote, was raised to the presidency and has been maintained there solely by the recollection of a victory which he gained 20 years ago under the walls of New Orleans, unquote. Jackson served in the military again during the First Seminole War. He was ordered by President James Monroe in December 1817 to lead a campaign in Georgia against the Seminole and Creek Indians. Jackson was also charged with preventing Spanish Florida from becoming a refuge for runaway slaves. Critics later alleged that Jackson exceeded orders in his Florida actions. His directions were to terminate the conflict. Jackson believed the best way to do this was to seize Florida from Spain once and for all. Before going, Jackson wrote to Monroe, a quote, "Let it be signified to be through any channel that the possession of the Floridas would be desirable to the United States, and in 60 days it will be accomplished," unquote.
He bypasses the Secretary of War and goes right to the President, to the main man, and says, "Just give me the word and I can take Florida." Now that's an act of war, and only Congress can declare war. Well, in those days. But the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army. And Jackson is convinced, and so am I, that Monroe does give him that authority.
When Jackson distrusted the British, he had every reason for doing so. The British actually had been behind the Indian uprising. The British were encouraging the Spanish to mischief in Florida. The British recognized that the United States was a long-term threat to Britain's power in North America and in the Atlantic. And they were doing everything they could to contain that power, to keep it bottled up.
The Seminole attack left their villages vulnerable, and Jackson burned their houses and the crops. He found letters that indicated that the Spanish and British were secretly assisting the Indians. Jackson believed that the United States could not be secure as long as Spain and the British encouraged Indians to fight, and argued that his actions were undertaken in self-defense. Jackson captured Pensacola, Florida, with little more than some warning shots, and deposed the Spanish governor. He captured and then tried and executed 2 British subjects, Robert Ambrister and Alexander Arbuthnot, who had been supplying and advising the Indians. Jackson's actions struck fear into the Seminole tribes as word spread of his ruthlessness in battle, and Jackson became known as Sharp Knife. The executions and Jackson's invasion of territory belonging to Spain, a country with which the US was not at war, created an international incident. Many in the Monroe administration called for Jackson to be censored. The Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, an early believer in manifest destiny, defended Jackson. When the Spanish minister demanded a suitable punishment for Jackson, Adams wrote back, I quote, "Spain must immediately decide either to place a force in Florida adequate at once to the protection of her territory, or cede to the United States a province of which she retains nothing but the nominal possession, but which is, in fact, a post of annoyance to them." Unquote. Adams used Jackson's conquest and Spain's own weakness to get Spain to cede Florida to the United States by the Adams-Onis Treaty. Jackson was subsequently named Florida's military governor and served from March 10, 1821 to December 31, 1821. The Tennessee legislature nominated Jackson for president in 1822. It also elected him U.S. Senator again.
What really got Jackson's attention, what really convinced him that he had to put his hat in the ring, was when people said, "You are a soldier. You have said that you support the interests of the American people. Well, if you're serious about this, and if the American people call you to office, you have no choice but to answer the call." So Jackson allowed his name to be put into nomination for the presidency in 1824.
By 1824, the Democratic Republican Party had become the only functioning national party. Its presidential candidates had been chosen by an informal congressional nominating caucus, but this had become unpopular. In 1824, most of the Democratic Republicans in Congress boycotted the caucus. Those who attended backed Treasury Secretary William H. Crawford for president and Albert Gallatin for vice president. A Pennsylvania convention nominated Jackson for president a month later, stating that the irregular caucus ignored the voice of the people and was a vain hope that the American people might be thus deceived into a belief that he, Crawford, was the regular Democratic candidate.
The election campaign of 1820 was probably the dirtiest campaign in American political history. Everything that Jackson had done wrong, or that anybody thought had done wrong, was dragged out and used against him.
They said some terrible things about his mother, Jackson's mother. They said she was a prostitute who was brought to this country to service British soldiers, and of Rachel Jackson, that she was a bigamist, and by implication, if not otherwise, a whore.
Rachel never states that she's aware that she's become a liability for her husband. I think she was always confident in his love for her, even if perhaps she may have sensed that some of those around him might have seen her as baggage.
Gallatin criticized Jackson as an honest man and the idol of the worshippers of military glory, but stressed that his incapacity, military habits, and habitual disregard of laws and constitutional provisions altogether makes him unfit for the office. Besides Jackson and Crawford, the Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and House Speaker Henry Clay were also candidates. Jackson received the most popular votes, but not a majority, and 4 states had no popular ballot. The electoral votes were split 4 ways, with Jackson having a plurality. Because no candidate received a majority, the election was decided by the House of Representatives, which chose Adams. Jackson's supporters denounced the result as a corrupt bargain because Clay gave his state's support to Adams, who subsequently appointed Clay as Secretary of State. Jackson's defeat burnished his political credentials. However, many voters believed that Jackson, whom they called man of the people, had been robbed by the corrupt aristocrats of the East.
Clay was the hero of the West. He's from Kentucky until Jackson comes along. Jackson's from Tennessee. And Jackson is the greater hero, being the military hero. So Clay swings his support to John Quincy Adams, who carries the day, wins the presidency, becomes president, and turns around and names Henry Clay to be Secretary of State. Now, in our day and age, this might not seem like a big deal, but in those days, it was everything, because a succession of presidents before John Quincy Adams had gone from Secretary of State to president. So, in naming Henry Clay to be Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams essentially made him heir apparent to the presidency.
Jackson was furious. He publicly damned Clay for what he called a corrupt bargain.
He called him Judas of the West. Judas has received his 30 pieces of silver, and he will have the same ending.
Jackson and his supporters, they declared that the election had been stolen, the will of the people had been frustrated, and immediately in the spring of 1825, they began the campaign of 1828. We often think today that elections last a long time. Not at all. They don't have anything on the campaigns of the 1820s.
Jackson denounced the alleged corrupt bargain that had put Adams in the White House and laid plans for a crusade to oust Adams from office. After resigning the Senate in October 1825, he continued his quest for the presidency. The Tennessee legislature again nominated Jackson for president. He attracted Vice President John C. Calhoun, Martin Van Buren, and Thomas Ritchie into his camp. Van Buren, with help from his friends in Philadelphia and Richmond, revived many of the ideals of the old Republican Party, gave it a new name as the Democratic Party, and forged a national organization of durability. Jackson, with Calhoun as his running mate, handily defeated Adams in 1828. During the election, Jackson's opponents referred to him as a jackass. Jackson liked the name and used the jackass as a symbol for a while, but it died out. However, it later became the symbol for the Democratic Party when cartoonist Thomas Nast popularized it later in the century. The campaign was very much a personal one, as was the custom of the time. Neither candidate personally campaigned, but their political followers organized many campaign events. Both candidates were rhetorically attacked in the press, which reached a low point when the press accused Jackson's wife, Rachel, of bigamy. Though the accusation was technically true, as were most personal attacks leveled against him during the campaign, it was based on events that occurred many years prior to Jackson's emergence. Jackson said he would forgive those who insulted him, but he would never forgive the ones who attacked his wife. Rachel died suddenly on December 22, 1828, before his inauguration, and was buried on Christmas Eve.
General Jackson! General Jackson!
What is it? At the moment of his greatest political victory, he suffers the most severe personal blow he could imagine. Rachel had been his lifelong companion, had been the love of his life, and now she's taken from him.
On the day that they had originally scheduled to go to Washington, Rachel was buried instead, and Jackson chose to bury her in the garden at the Hermitage, which she had loved so much.
Jackson was absolutely convinced that she was murdered by those people who had said these things about her. And on her tombstone, he had written that here lies, a sainted being who was viciously attacked, but whose virtue could surpass it all.
He blamed the Adams campaigners for her death, saying, I quote, "May God Almighty forgive her murderers, I never can," unquote.
He almost decided not to go to Washington. He believed that his emotional life, in a certain sense, was over. And for months after, he was in a very deep depression. He wrote, the one thing that made him decide that he had to go was, first of all, the people had chosen him. And Jackson had an absolute reverence for the will of the people. But there was also something personal, and that was, my enemies have killed Rachel. They will pay. So off he goes to be inaugurated president.
Jackson also came under heavy attack as a slave trader who bought and sold slaves and moved them about in defiance of modern standards or morality. Jackson's name has been associated with Jacksonian democracy in terms of the passing of political power from established elites to ordinary voters based in political parties. The age of Jackson shaped the national agenda and American politics. Jackson's philosophy as president followed much in the same line as Thomas Jefferson, advocating Republican values held by the Revolutionary War generation. Jackson's presidency held a high moralistic tone, having as a planter himself agrarian sympathies, a limited view of states' rights and the federal government. Jackson feared that monies and business interests would corrupt Republican values. When South Carolina opposed the tariff law, he took a strong line in favor of nationalism and against secession. Jackson believed that the president's authority was derived from the people, and when selecting his cabinet instead of choosing party favorites, Jackson instead selected plain businessmen whom he intended to control. Jackson chose Martin Van Buren of New York as Secretary of State, John Eaton of Tennessee as Secretary of War, Samuel D. Ingham of Pennsylvania as Secretary of Treasury, John Branch of North Carolina as Secretary of Navy, John Berrien of Georgia as Attorney General, and William T. Berry of Kentucky as Postmaster General. Jackson's first choice of cabinet proved to be unsuccessful, full of bitter partisanship and gossip, especially between Eaton, Calhoun, and Van Buren. By the spring of 1831, only Berry remained, while the rest of Jackson's cabinet had been discharged, and Jackson's following cabinet selections worked better together. On March 4, 1829, Andrew Jackson became the first United States president-elect to take the oath of office on the east portico of the U.S. Capitol. Jackson was the first president to invite the public to attend the White House ball honoring his first inauguration. Many poor people came to the inaugural ball in their homemade clothes. The crowd became so large that Jackson's guards could not keep them out of the White House, which became so crowded with people that dishes and decorative pieces inside were eventually broken.
They poured into the rooms, and they thought they would knock the walls down. There were so many of them. They were jammed in. Poor Jackson himself was almost pinned against the wall, and he had to be helped out of the building and to his hotel in order to save him. And finally it got so bad they thought the man would collapse. So they took the liquor and the other food that was being served out into the lawn, and people jumped through the windows to get to it. It was the people's candidate, the people's celebration.
This week's edition of People in History salutes Andrew Jackson, a man who is known as one of the most controversial presidents of the United States due to his personality and certain actions.
Americans have always looked at Andrew Jackson and seen themselves. But over the years, they've looked at Andrew Jackson and seen different versions of themselves. At one time, they saw the frontiersman, the poor boy made good, the classic self-made man. Today, some Americans look back at Jackson and they see the slaveholder, the Indian oppressor, even the Indian hater. So the debate about Andrew Jackson is a very contemporary one. He's an inescapable, quintessential American, but of what kind? Is he a man whom we should admire, or is he a man whom we should despise? Is he a man whom we should celebrate, or is he a man for whom we should apologize?
I have seen him attempt it repeatedly, and as often, choke with rage.
This week's edition of People and History was voiced by Xavier Roberts, scripted and sourced by Jane Owa, and terrifically produced by Joseph Manasseh. Among useful sites include personality.com, biography.com, history.com, among others.